To everybody, welcome to this webinar from the International Centre of Excellence in Water Resources Management in Adelaide, South Australia. My name is Neil Palmer. I'm chairing this session today for you. I'm Principal Engineer Water with Tonkin Consulting in South Australia. Today's registrants come from across the globe. Here is an indication of where our people who are listening and watching today come from. Welcome to all of you. Just a note for some upcoming seminars or webinars from the iSwarm, particularly the 15th of March is the next one, which features Jerry Doyle and Craig Katz from Tonkin Consulting about sustainable food production related to the Northern Adelaide Irrigation Scheme. Moving on, our agenda today, the format is 15 minutes of presentations from Mr. Graham Dooley, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A, which is open to all. There is a recording. A link will be emailed to you if you've registered. And at the end of the session, there will be a feedback form, which we'd love you to fill in. It'll come about 1 minute. It's very quick. And our comments would be very helpful for us to shape future seminars. So without further ado, you can read some background on Mr. Graham Dooley, who is well known and needs very little introduction to people in Australia. But internationally, he has been working in the water industry for some 45 years in both government and private sector. Currently the CEO of Water Utilities Australia Proprietary Limited, Graham is going to speak about his perceptions and experience on the future of the water industry. So without further ado, thank you, Graham.
All right. Thank you very much, Neil, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're from. I'll just get this one up. As the name suggests, Water Utilities Australia has got something to do with water utilities, and typical of most water utility presentations, there's water involved, and this is our little graphic for water. Now, why should I be a suitable person to make comments about water utilities and what they might be in the future? Well, I've spent about 45 years in water utilities in my working career, and roughly half and half between the public water utility sector and the private water utility sector. For 20 of those years, I've been a CEO of some business of some form, and 10 years on top of that as a divisional general manager running a big department within a larger business. I had the great honour and pleasure of being 2 years elected to be the national president of the Australian Water Association, and for 11 years prior to that I was the South Australian branch president. Now, reflecting on those 45 years, and it started off in the public sector, water in all its forms, in rivers, in dams, agricultural water and drinking water, has changed quite dramatically but subtly from being a public service like national defence or law and order to a regulated industry. The second change is that regulation, whether it's drinking water regulation or environmental or economic regulation of prices and standards of customer service, has turned every water utility, at least in Australia and certainly the UK, in much of America and in other countries around the world, has changed it into a business. It has a business that has income and it has expenditure and it has a balance sheet that has both assets and liabilities. What we've seen recently in the last 30 or 40 years is there's a vast body of superannuation or pension funds, as they're known in some parts of the world, that now wants to invest in water in all its forms, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. And fourthly, the behaviour of people has changed dramatically, as is evidenced in the response to that by the UK regulator Ofwat, and we're seeing it in water utility regulators all around the world, and in many of the utilities. Customers' attitudes and perception is changing. That requires the staff and the people in the industry to change. The political leaders have certainly changed in most jurisdictions and both sides of politics, of what their perception of water and its role in society is. And of course, the journalists and commentators have changed. Now, what I'll do in this session, given that my topic is a very broad one, is concentrate on two of these aspects. That's number 2 and 3, in which I've been intimately involved now for more than 20 years. I'm happy to come back and take any questions on the first of those four topics, or the fourth one, but those really are topics in themselves for another day. Now, the question is often posed, are government owners of water utilities going to sell? Are they going to want to tap in to the sort of investment capital that the big pension funds and superannuation funds have available? And by government, I mean whatever the jurisdiction is that currently owns a water utility. Sometimes in Australia, if I use the Australian example, Australia has a constitution which says that water is a state responsibility. So the 300 or so water utilities in Australia are mostly owned by state governments and local governments, the vast majority being relatively small utilities, and they're owned by local government. There are, of course, a number of utilities that are established by farmers to provide irrigation water, and there are probably about a dozen of those utilities in Australia. And increasingly over the next 10 years, I think that the owners of these utilities, whether they're state government or local government or farmers, and in some cases industry, I think the answer is yes. And that's because of a couple of things. With proper and effective regulation as to quality and fitness for purpose, such as we see in the food industry and most of the human consumables that we have, with proper regulation, there is no change in the retail price that's charged for water or sewage services or the performance of the water utility. A change in ownership does not mean an improvement in performance necessarily, or it certainly doesn't mean a degradation in performance, because the standard of performance, whether it's a sewage discharge or drinking water quality, is governed by regulation. And I include the word effective in there because the regulation has actually got to work. No use having a regulator that doesn't work properly. I'm assuming, as we have in Australia here, that the regulators work properly, and they are largely don't care whether the owner of a water utility is a government body or an investor-owned body. They will implement their regulation without fear or favour. Now, the use of public-private partnership capital, as we've seen around the states, has had mixed success in the past because the cost of capital is too high. And I'll come back to this cost of capital issue because it's a very significant force in the industry. It could be corrected, this cost of capital problem could be corrected in future build, own, operate or PPP contracts. But governments are wary of going down a path that's had mixed results. However, there's a couple of standout examples of where the engagement of private capital has been very successful. Sydney Water sold its desalination plant very successfully. The cost of capital was acceptably low, and the regulator set the price that could be charged from the investor-owned desalination plant to Sydney Water for supply of water. Hunter Water also sold an industrial micro utility last year, and the company that I head up was the buyer of that utility, also acceptable in terms of the cost of capital. Many local governments around Australia and farmer groups who own water utilities are getting to the point where they're not convinced that it's sensible to continue owning a water utility. If you own a water utility, you're subject to quite stringent regulation on standards, technical standards for water, drinking water and environmental discharge, as well as pricing standards. And there is a fair amount of regulatory response required in terms of submitting quarterly or 6-monthly or annual compliance reports to a regulator. And a whole lot of these owners, particularly local government, would like to recycle the capital that's tied up in this utility and use it for other priorities. I'm talking to the chief executive of one local government who's saying, look, I've got a forward capital program for my local government area of $200 million. And this is all sorts of community facilities, sporting facilities for kids, improved transportation, amenity in the central township area of his area. And he says, I've got about 40 or $50 million tied up in assets in my water utility. Do I really need to own a water utility, or could I get an investor to buy it and operate it for me? I'm happy to buy the water out of it, but do I need to own it? Could I recycle that capital and use it towards my $200 million capital works program? And the answer is now, yes. Historically, the answer has been no. Investors, this vast body of investment capital that's in the big pension and superannuation funds of the world, and mostly in Western countries, I think, uh, has generally invested in things like mining and banking and retail, manufacturing, all those sorts of things where you can go down to the stock exchange and buy shares. And generally, those sort of shares give you an annual return through a dividend or capital growth in the share price that's much higher than a water utility would give you. And so buying shares in a water utility hasn't been a very sensible thing to do if you're an investor. But in more recent decades, that answer is changing from a no to probably a yes. And the the issue of why that is the UK water industry has created now 29 years, by my reckoning, of water utility investment experience. So the London Stock Exchange is very familiar with it. All the investors are very familiar with what happens when you invest in a water utility. And most water utilities in the UK are owned by investors, that's either individuals or funds, with a superannuation outlook. The regulated water utilities of the UK, and indeed the rest of the world, are amongst the most stable of investments for people who are in pension phase. And I'm one of them. I'm old enough to be of the age where a superannuation pension that's going to last me for the rest of my life is suitable. And I don't want to invest in sending rockets to Mars or uranium mining or any of these speculative or volatile stocks. I want to invest my superannuation money from which my pension is going to be drawn in something that's pretty stable. And if you look at all the businesses of the world, there are very few that are as stable as water utilities. I think the regulatory profile that was established in the UK, in which the utilities deliver a return that is sort of inflation plus a bit. I've written it down here as CPI plus X, but in the UK it's RPI plus X. And typically X is around about 3 to 5%. And so if your inflation is 2%, you're getting 2% plus somewhere between 3 and 5. And most people who have funds invested in the pension phase of their lives are happy with that. They would like some shares that are a bit more up and down and potentially produce some higher results, but most people are going to be happy to invest in that. Now, the economic regulators of Australia certainly regulate the capital that's invested in a water utility on a similar basis. And they say the answer is about CPI plus 4 or 5, depending on what the circumstances of the utility are, depending on whether it's big or small. Interestingly enough, in this different rating of returns and risks that occurred, the Thames Tideway project sets a new bar for investments in a specific project. So not just a utility, but a project, which goes back to the public-private partnership or BOOTS type contracts, but also defined a new type of risk profile that suits those ultra-low returns. So if this happens and water utilities, large and small, and probably the small ones initially, if they are sold to a group of investors, would they work any differently? Well, I've worked in both sectors for decades. And I'd have to say that good water utility management and practice is the same in the public sector as it is in the private sector. There's basically no difference. And I think those among you who are listening who have or are working for the large Spanish or French companies or the English companies would say similarly. It's just a general observation that good management is good management wherever it occurs. Also, on the other side, so is bad management. You can have badly managed parts of water utilities in the public sector as well as the private sector. There's no difference. And therefore, except for the shareholders different, there ought to be no difference. But there is. There is a difference in the culture that you can observe, notwithstanding good management and bad management and so on. And this difference bears some further evaluation. I'd be encouraging of our universities for anyone who's interested in the sociology and the human behaviour in large organisations to have a look at it. It's probably worth a PhD in there somewhere to some enterprising student. There are lots of questions about what this difference is, but it's not about the capital structure and it's not about the prices. It's about the people and their motivation and what the motivation of the utility is. So getting back to the topic that they asked me to talk about, what does the future hold in my view? And I'd have to say, from this long career I've had and looking into the future, that capital recycling is more likely to occur than less likely as water utility owners, particularly governments, local governments and farmers, decide they want to use the capital that's tied up in a water utility for another purpose. If the price doesn't change and the standard of service doesn't change, does it really matter who owns it? That's the question that people are asking. And a number of those local government CEOs and mayors are now saying, gee, if I could recycle my $50 million capital into a $200 million capital works program, I think I might like to investigate that a bit further. I think our regulators, particularly our economic regulators in each state in Australia and other jurisdictions, will deal more with investor owners, and they'll be more inclined to do what Ofwat has done in the last decade or so and motivate outcomes. If you look at the Ofwat regulation in the UK, there has been a strong move in the last regulatory cycle to motivate a much greater customer-focused outcome. And that's been very successful for those utilities who've taken it up, and their shareholders seem to have done a few percentage points better. But for those who have resisted that, that's just not quite so good. So the regulator can motivate outcomes. I think one of the things that I've seen in my time in the private sector utilities is the investor-owned utilities are much keener to engage in technological adaptation and advancement to improve performance and to improve capital optimization. For instance, if I run a water utility that's investor owned and I'm facing a bill in the future, if I'm facing an expense in the future of, say, $1 billion to build a new water supply, a desalination plant or a dam or bore field or something, and I can delay that by fixing up all the leaks in my pipes or getting a much better outcome from my network, then I'm inclined to do that. And the way you can have a go at that is by investing far more in water metering and embedding instruments within a water network to understand how it's going. I think we're going to see a league table of performance like the UK will be published by regulators, including some shareholder related measures like returns on capital, efficiencies of capital deployment and so on. And this is likely to drive efficiency measures. Now, this occurred in the UK. When I first joined the UK water industry in the early 90s, I saw these tables produced by both the London Stock Exchange and all the stockbrokers who comment on investments, as well as by Ofwat, talking about how shareholders were gaining or losing or being advantaged by good or bad management. And so the introduction of dynamics of shareholders, whether they're government or not government, will get up the priority list of the regulators, I think. One thing that has happened in the UK and is happening in Australia is that people's expectations have a far greater influence. In years gone by, if the water supply went off for a few hours, people really just sort of grinned and just bear it and hope it gets back and connected again. It doesn't take very long these days before someone gets on Twitter or Facebook or starts ringing a radio station to start lodging complaints or please explains. And the water utilities have had to engage with their customers through the same sort of Twitter and Facebook type media to be much more communicative with them. And so customers have had a great influence on how water utilities behave and how they relate. And I would think that if a house is without a water supply for more than 2 or 3 or 4 hours maybe, there is a major newsworthy event on, and television cameras go around and interview people. So the behaviour of people and their expectation is something that the water utilities of the future are going to have pay a lot more attention to. One of the things that's obvious in all of this is that when a utility is owned by investors, outcomes are important. The actual process, the long-winded bureaucratic processes and form filling out and all that, really don't much matter. You've got to get to an outcome of a water supply or a sewage, a proper sewage system. And so water utilities, and I noticed this in the UK in the transition from government ownership to investor ownership, the water utilities became much more efficient in processing their decision making and much more efficient in processing their interaction with customers. The investment sector has got plenty of capital around. The stock exchanges are awash with capital. In Australia, about $1 billion of new capital per week goes into the investment capital markets, $1 billion a week. And that's got to find a home. You can always go down to the stock exchange and buy some shares with your $1 billion. There is plenty of capital available in most of the capital markets of the world. But if you think that water utilities can just soak up all this capital and not pay the right price for it, that's probably too simplistic a view. And capital must be wisely used. Capital has got to work to earn a return, and so it's got to be wisely used. Now, I've just concluded my little presentation with a couple of slides here of 2 of the 3 utilities that my company currently owns. This one, Wollonga Basin Water Company, and there are a few pictures there, is an irrigation utility that was created by originally 15 farmers. 15 farmers created this. It now supplies water to 200 farmers, and they grow a premium quality grape. And I hope, Neil and our viewers, you're drinking more McLaren Vale wine, because that promotes our customers' business. The other one is this one, a little reclaimed water utility that provides irrigation water to a housing estate, the Lightsview housing estate, which is about 3,000 houses. So I think, Neil, that brings me to the end of my little presentation, and I'd be happy to engage in any questions or be helpful to our listeners.
Thank you, Graham. Appreciate your comments there, and I'm sure it's created a lot of interest. I have a question from Martin O'Rourke from the Department of Industry in New South Wales. And he says, why would anybody want to own a utility if not for profit? If the price of the service is governed by a regulator, how can you make profit except by allowing the utility to run down? Also, there's a finite amount of water, and dependent on rainfall, if drought times, you will not make as much profit when water restrictions are in place. Good question.
That's an excellent question, Martin. And I think the answer is that the utilities of Australia do make profits. Now, sometimes that profit's not declared, or it's disguised, or it's buried in other things. But one of the requirements of water utilities in Australia, a requirement set by Australia's government and signed up to by all the states, is that water utilities have got to cover their operating costs and their cost of capital. Now, it's important, this cost of capital argument is, if a water utilities owners invest capital in the water utility, then there is a fit and proper rate of return on that investment, plus the operating cost. And that's the whole basis of economic regulation in Australia. And you can look in the annual accounts, which often are a bit obscure, but if on the big standalone utilities, SA Water in the state where I live, or Sydney Water where I come from, you can see what that is. A water utility that's not making a profit is going bankrupt slowly. And that is not in anyone's interest. And so that is a problem that governments are trying to cure. We will certainly, as an investor, invest in companies that are in water utilities that are making very little profit with the objective of improving their cost structure or investing new capital. Sometimes the price goes up, not always, but they do need to behave like a business. You'd be surprised, Martin, how steady a water utilities revenue is if measured over a cycle of 3 to 5 years. It's not very dependent on droughts and floods and all of those sort of things. A lot of the revenue comes from sewerage, and sewerage is generally a fixed fee depending on the property type that you're occupying. And so that's why, if you look at all the water utilities of Australia, the 300 of them, they're actually quite stable in their financial performance.
Thank you. We have a question waiting from Kazuya Naito from Tokyo Water. But before that, I understand we have a live question from Professor Graham Dandy.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Graham, thank you for your presentation. I suppose a lot of what you've said applies more to the traditional water supply and sewerage sectors. And I'm wondering about the stormwater area, where there's a lot of money in infrastructure, and a lot of the infrastructure is in need of replacement or expansion. There are issues with flooding and all that sort of thing. I wonder to what extent private capital could be utilised in the stormwater sector, and how there would be a return to the private investor.
Graham, that's an excellent question, and goes to two matters. One is a stormwater management service that takes floods and routes them down channels and out into the ocean or a river, is that a public service like our police force or our public health system or our national defence, or is it a commodity or a regulated industry? And that's a question for the politicians to answer. Now, if I inherited an old, poorly performing stormwater service, I could turn it into a business, but the customers of that business, who are presumably the properties in the catchment area, would need to pay a fee for the upgrade of the infrastructure and then the proper operations and maintenance of that. And interestingly, Graham, that's exactly how it was done 80 years ago in Sydney. In Sydney, the then Water Board was also responsible for stormwater, and a small fixed charge was levied on the value of each piece of land in the catchment area, and that provided a revenue stream to operate and maintain and invest in the stormwater system. So I think if you're long in the tooth like I am, then you can remember that some of these answers have been invented before, but have been overtaken by other events or changes in legislation. There's not a lot new in this. And just reflecting on charging for a water service like a stormwater service or a sewage service on the basis of the value of land, the first written record of that, I think, is in about 970 AD in England. So that's more than 1,000 years ago. So sewage rates, or water rates as they, whatever it was called in those days, have been around for a very long time. And regulators are pretty conservative by their nature and are attracted to doing things that have worked in the past.
Thank you, Graham. I forgot to mention Professor Graham Dandy is from the University of Adelaide. The next question, as I said, from Kazuya Naito from Tokyo Water is, when entrusting the water supply business to the private sector, what should one be most careful about? How far should local government oversee private water service providers? Graham.
Yes, I think this answer has two parts. One is more a financial and standards part, and one is a human behaviour part. Water utilities work best when they're regulated. And so it's not just a question of handing a business to the private sector or a group of investors. It's handing the investors a set of rules under which the business is to be conducted. Now, if you look at the food industry of Japan and also Australia and most other countries, food is regulated and quite heavily regulated because it has got to be edible. You've got to be able to eat it without getting sick. So although you don't see that in the supermarket or the food store, there is quite a heavy regulation of what constitutes proper food. In the same way, there's quite heavy regulation by the drinking water regulator or the environmental discharge regulator or the economic regulator or the occupational health and safety regulator of the proper performance of a water utility function, whether it's owned by government or owned by investors. I think in most jurisdictions, and I'm pretty sure in Japan this is the case, all of those regulations are in place, and they will determine the technical aspects of water supply as well as the price. Now, the second part of the question, what about the humans? Because humans are the customers of water, and humans are the people who get elected to government. And there is no doubt in my mind that one of the sets of standards that an investor-owned water utility or a government-owned water utility must adopt is the way it deals with its people, its customers, its people, its elected official in its local government areas, the standards of performance of disrupting traffic when a water main breaks and the street needs to be dug up, or any of those human interactions must be properly dealt with. And whether that's a role for the local government jurisdiction to have oversight, or a state government jurisdiction, or a formally constituted regulator, really doesn't much matter. Water utilities, in my observation and experience, work best when there's someone who's watching them and has set a set of rules.
Thank you. We have another question from Siamsul Hidayat from Indonesia this time. Here in Indonesia, he writes, water is mostly supplied by state-owned enterprises. Water can be supplied for potable purposes by a few private companies. Are there any possibilities in the future that these companies will be allowed to fulfill other purposes?
My career has suggested to me that companies that are good at something ought to stick to what they're good at. And so you don't find airlines also masquerading as construction contractors. And if a company is good at providing a water supply, and if there are opportunities for expansion, then it seems to me to be a legitimate business thing that they can expand. However, if the jurisdiction, and I have not much knowledge of Indonesia, but if the jurisdiction that runs the regulation and sets the standard and runs the state-owned enterprise, if that jurisdiction wants there to be other participants in it, such as the companies that you mention, then that is fine and good, provided they're properly regulated. But if the jurisdiction doesn't want those companies to do more than provide bottled water or whatever the water supply they're providing is, then everyone's got to be happy with that. So it's ultimately a political decision by our elected leaders as to what form of industry we have. In Australia, the legislation in each state has changed a little bit in recent years, and the most modern of those pieces of legislation is here in South Australia, where I am, that creates a truly level playing field between government-owned water utilities and investor-owned water utilities. The other states are reviewing their legislation and taking a look at what the South Australian experience is. But as the amount of capital that's needed to be applied to network renewal and old treatment plant upgrades and so on, that amount of capital is so large that it's starting to affect the public purse and the allocation of capital to schools and law and order and things. Then the jurisdictions are making a decision about whether they should mobilise the vast investment capital resources of the superannuation funds in supplying some capital into that sector. And that answer is increasingly yes rather than no.
Thank you. And I think there's one last question here. It doesn't say where it comes from, but it says, in your opinion, how would you rank the most profitable sectors of the water utilities if you were to break them up?
There's an old saying that I think derives from England. Neil may be able to help me out here. Where there's muck, there's money. So the dirtier the business, the more money there is to be made in it. And I suppose that has governed solid waste and sewerage. So as surprising as it may seem, probably sewerage is more capital intensive than water as a general rule. The sewerage system is demanding of more capital. And because a water utility earns a rate of return on capital, then you would probably want to invest more in the sewerage side than the water side of a business. However, most water utilities in Australia, this is not the United States, where it's quite different, but most water utilities in Australia do water and sewerage, and so there's no choice. Once you get one, you get the other. But I wouldn't think that there is much difference in the profitability of either sector because the regulator controls what the prices are. So if a sector, if for instance a utility was running its sewage system far more profitably, then the regulator would like to adjust the prices of the sewage service down a little bit and perhaps compensate by an upward adjustment in the price of the drinking water utility.
Thank you, Graham. We have a couple of other comments and questions, but we'll respond to them by text because our time is gone. Without further ado, thank you very much, Graham, for this presentation and the stimulating response that we've had from people. And just a reminder of future webinars coming up. Remember the 15th of March. And with that, we'll sign off and say goodbye. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Good afternoon or morning.